The Kokinshū is a product of the Heian court, years roughly 794 to 1185. Following the Naras, Emperor Kammu moves the capital to Heian, which is modern-day Kyoto. Fujiwara clan develops as a power center, a very prominent family that has a habit of marrying its daughters into ascending imperial power structures. So the Fujiwara clan, emperors can come and go. The Fujiwara clan is the major player in that arena for a while, not unlike the Medicis, let's say, in Florence in the Renaissance. As it does develop its own prominence, the influence of the Chinese starts to wane, starts to fade. The Japanese vernacular literature flourishes, particularly literature attuned to, about, and often written by women. Some of the greatest novelists well, some of the people who developed and in fact invented the novel were women living in the Heian court and writing about it. But the poetry itself is also very indicative of this period. It's very refined, it's very elegant, very sweet and delicate in a way that is a bit of a rebuke of, or at least answer to, the more aggressive, masculine, Chinese influenced, ancestor, archaic influenced way of the Nara period before it. And significantly, I think it's important to see this as a kind of continuum, is that the feminine quality of the Heian period was also where you saw the rise of samurai culture, and that very aggressive masculine warrior class that came about because of a kind of lawlessness between the cities. You were safe when you were in a city. It was all peachy keen, but if you tried to get to another one, man, there are some robbers out there. They'll just leave you for dead in a ditch. So samurai culture developed as a kind of private police force against that. But you can see these castes as, well, the Heians were, let's say, generally more feminine coded, and the macho Nara and samurai cultures much more masculine. That tends to, it's not always true in every particular, but it is a broad statement that you can make about these movements that can help you find your footing within them. And once you can distinguish something, you get a toehold on it, you can start to climb it. When you're just sort of looking at it and say, I don't know what they're saying or why they're saying it that way, it's very hard to get anywhere. But if you can contrast it to something earlier, something different, something that came after or before that you know is distinct in very different ways, that helps you see some of the nuance, see some of the shading, and you can start to judge, well, okay, this is what this is trying to do, as opposed to that other thing was trying to do something very different. That is one way into stuff like this, which might not be completely familiar. This is, however, one of the most famous anthologies of literature in world history. It is the first fully vernacular anthology of imperially embossed poetry. The emperor himself specifically said, I want poems. I want a book of poems, and gathered them all together. So automatically, this should be setting off bells. Ding, ding, ding. This has a kind of political purpose. And yeah, it is Japanese nationalism. They are rejecting a lot of the Chinese forms that came before them. They are rejecting a lot of the Chinese influence. They are asserting that we as Japanese have our own culture, our own vernacular language. We don't need all of the Chinese. They came up with their own writing system, the Kana script, which is independent of Chinese writing, so that they can fully put their stamp, their identity into their literature, and have this as an example of their culture that they can pass on down through generations to celebrate that culture and give future generations the opportunity to look back and say, yeah, that's what the authentic Japanese voice is. Get rid of all of the Chinese influences. This is from the land itself. It worked. This model of poetry was essentially codified into Japanese culture for roughly 1,000 years until they shaved off some of the poems just a little bit more to get down to the haiku form. All of the poems here are relatively short. All but 9, there are about 1,100 poems altogether. All but 9 are in that very short tanka form, which is like 5 lines of 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 7 syllables. That creates again, that very chiseled, lean expressiveness that can pretty much hint at enormous pockets of meaning out there, but that is singularly focused on creating a single impression, a single moment, evoking a single emotion, a single idea, and then that, once you have that, you can extrapolate into any number of things as long as your mind is fruitful. But that concentration is what you get in this form of poetry. It begins with a very famous preface, the Kana preface or Japanese preface, that functions as a declaration of purpose. This is what we think poetry is. It was written by Kino Tsurayuki, who wrote in this same book. There's an excerpt of his famous Tosa diary. Very well regarded scholar of his time, and he carves out a place for what poetry is supposed to be. And he throws a little shade at the Chinese influence, says, yeah, that's okay, it's a little bloated, a little bit flabby. But what you want is something much leaner, something more specific, and in fact, more natural. He didn't like all of the art built around the Chinese model. All of the long poems with elaborate forms, elaborate conceits, elaborate themes. He liked lean and mean. Lean and mean expressions of pure spontaneity. All of these poems are written as if they just come to you in a flash. They have that kind of electric quality. They are all sudden. And that's an aesthetic choice. It's not so removed. It's not so considered. It's not Itomaro, whom the preface singles out as a sage of poetry, one of the 2 most important poets in the Japanese pantheon as far as as far as the preface is concerned, but he's pointing to those older poets who were perhaps too enthralled with the artifice of it, too invested in constructing these complicated poems with too many images, too many poetic devices, too much going on that just waters down the effect. It looked like they worked too hard to write those damn poems. A poem, according to this preface, should be immediate, should be obvious, should be like somebody just came up with it on the spot. Because they are communicating very immediate, very specific, very intense emotional reactions to something. And that is a analog of nature itself, quite honestly. That idea that you are going to put away all of the artistic bells and whistles and just go for something authentic, something passionate. That's what poetry is supposed to be, according to this. You get some shade thrown at a number of different poets. Poetry is like a painting of a woman which stirs one's heart in vain. Cute. Another poet, too much feelings, too few words. Guy's just not getting the job done. Poems are like withered flowers, faded but with a lingering fragrance. I'm not sure that's a good thing. Another poet is like a tradesman attired in elegant robes. You know, mediocre poetry dressed up, so to speak. So he is taking on this idea of everything that came before us, specifically everything that was too heavily influenced by the Chinese models, is kind of garbage. It is inauthentic. And what we want to do is produce a poetry that speaks a very authentic and human, natural voice. One that bursts forth without all of the trappings of poetry. And so you get these very short poems written in very specific orders. It's a big book, 1,100 or so poems, even though they're short, but it is arranged in certain ways, and even that is sort of instructive. There are 6 books dedicated to seasons. 2 for spring, 2 for autumn, 1 for spring, 1 for summer, or 1 for summer, 1 for winter. And if you just think about, well, in the Menyosho, there's an awful lot of spring and autumn going on in those too. Well, those are times of very conspicuous change. Those are times of great drama. Let's face it, winter, and especially by the time you make it to August, summer, just feels like it goes on forever. But spring and fall, you see these influences where it is constantly appearing to change. So that alone tells you what the project of this anthology is, to try and capture the idea of change. Change trumps stasis. Always developing, always evolving. That passionate sense that locks poetry and nature together. The first one dealt with, and we can see it here, the opening poems, is Book 1, Spring. Spring has come before the year's turning. Should I speak now of the old year or call this the new year? Well, you know, who hasn't written the wrong date on something in January? Oh, I forgot, it's last year or whatever. That sort of trips you up. But here it's the very beginning of spring, just like the very beginning of this book. It is not just late spring when you see the flowers and the butterflies and everything is green and warm. This is very early spring. The spring has come before the year's turning. Should I speak now of the old year or call this the new year? Peculiarities of individual calendars aside, a calendar that tells you that, okay, it's the first day of spring, often has no relation to what the weather is outside. Nature is independent of the calendar. The calendar was made by what? Human beings. A calendar is culture. A calendar is tradition. A calendar is handed down from generation to generation, culture to culture, civilization to civilization. But that is on its own thing, separate from nature. Nature will do what nature wants, irrespective of the calendar. So you see that line getting drawn between the two, between culture and nature. And in this book, nature is always going to win. Waters, I cup my hands to drink, wetting my sleeves, still frozen. Might this first day of spring's wind thaw them? Another poem about cold, early spring. The book is setting it up in that order, so that the early poems are about the first little brush with spring, and it will develop throughout. Also, the idea that spring is kind of vulnerable at this point. Spring is an impulse within the season before it's actually the season. And that creates a kind of vulnerability. Imagine just like, those first little seeds in the garden that might be thinking about bursting out. But the cold wind is holding it down. The cold and the frost is keeping that little seed from cracking out and expressing itself. That sense of vulnerability is key. Remember, the Heian culture is about the delicate, the fragile, the genteel. But that implies a obvious contrast with harshness in the environment, with the world itself around you might be very coarse, and that is in opposition to you being very genteel. But you can already see the parallelism being set up here, that everybody else is coarse and trying to destroy me, but I am spring, I am a flower, and I will ultimately win out. Number 3, where are the promised mists of spring in Yoshino, fair hills of Yoshino, snow falling still? The seasons themselves are kind of in conflict. Winter's not ready to go just yet. Spring is sort of here, but not really, and they themselves are having their own little battle. And we are all just innocent bystanders in that. Time passes. Number 24, even the greens of the evergreen pine are refreshed by the coming of spring. It's starting to get green. It's starting to warm up. But those laws of change in nature apply to everyone. The evergreens and what are these? Carnivorous? Coniferous? I don't know. Yeah, okay, that. I don't remember that stuff. But nature is moving on. Number 69, on hills where mists of spring trail, glowing faintly, do the flowers' fading colors foretell their fall? When you're looking at a flower, are you thinking immediately of, well, death? Maybe. It will die. Yeah. Little Buddhism here, perhaps. The belief of death in life, life with death. And yet, little Buddhism, perhaps. Maybe a little animism, a little Shinto. On hills where mists of spring trail glowing faintly. Myths of spring, that seems almost like a visible spirit. Spiritualism in nature. Could be. I don't know if it is or not, but the poems are suggesting these little things, throwing out little lines, little ideas, little images here and there that prompt these associations and nudge me towards what it could mean. If saying stay would stop their falling, could I hold these blossoms more dear? And then 71, it's their falling without regret I admire. Cherry blossoms, a world of sadness if they'd stayed. Meditation on death, how death's indifference to us kind of makes life more sweet. But also just look at how this is going. These are all individual poems arranged in this manner, so it's kind of telling a story. Not just the broad story that we spoke about of how, in the very beginning, spring isn't really spring, it's more winter, and then getting progressively warmer. But here, it's turning over this idea of impermanence. Things will come, things will go. Is there a spirit that will transcend time? But also that sense of, how do we function within that notion of perpetual death and rebirth and death? We are vulnerable within it. We need to appreciate that vulnerability, if not celebrate it, in order to be more fully human. I seem bound to sleep in this village tonight, led astray by falling blossoms. I've forgotten my way home. Interesting. Now, on its own, that's a neat little drama right there, a little statement. But remember, this is poem 72 after the previous 3 that are all about these ideas getting churned around. Maybe a little animism, maybe a little Buddhism, maybe a little impermanence, maybe a little detachment. All of these ideas getting churned around and around and around and around. And the thing with ideas that get churned around and around and around is you can get lost. When I seem bound to sleep in this village tonight, led astray by falling blossoms. I've forgotten my way home. He's lost in his own thoughts of spring. And it is going to force him to sleep outside for the night. And I don't think it's that warm out just yet. And honestly, that getting lost, falling blossoms, this is just the old Hollywood hack in me, but I can't read that without thinking of Dorothy and the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion all falling asleep in the poppy field because they get lost and they start enjoying the flowers, and it's poppy flowers, which is what they make opium out of, and they're all just suddenly forgetting that they have a job to do. Because you can get lost in ideas, just like you can get lost in wine or opium or anything like an idea without letting it go. You can dance with an idea, but you have to let it go. Are they not like this fleeting world? Cherry blossoms, no sooner do they flower than they fall. More change in mutability, more Buddhist detachment. Another warning, perhaps, that if you don't want to fall, you need to understand this character of the cherry blossoms. Beautiful, delicate, but perhaps dangerous. Autumn! From that first day, the winds of autumn sounded. The tips of trees on Ottawa Mountain's peak were turning color. Kind of suddenness, from that first day. Remember the slow transition from winter into spring, but here autumn seems to come much more abruptly. The winds of autumn sounded on the tips of trees on Ottawa's mountain's peak. And supposedly in the original, you read the little footnote, there's a little pun in there about the sound that is being made there, but more sense of inevitability, of the power of nature, the overwhelming power of nature, the often sudden power of nature that we are all subject to. White dew of a single color, how then does it dye the leaves of autumn 1,000 different shades? This begins a short series of poems on what makes the leaves change color. And putting aside science, it's a meditation on cause and effect in a scientific way. And here I would ask you to cast back, as I do from time to time, to an age where they really didn't know what made the leaves change color, where the science was not a vocabulary at their disposal. So they had to look up at nature and the universe around them and just guess and say, I don't know what is going on here, but I can try. More vulnerability, more sense of being very, very small, very, very fragile, very, very vulnerable in a often hostile universe. Book 11, love! Memories revive, as on evergreen mountains, wild azalea flares. Unspoken love burns stronger for the silence where it dwells. Unspoken love. Well, if you speak about it, it becomes public, but if you hold it in, it is private, right? So there's that public-private dynamic going on again, but with a clear preference for keeping it private, keeping it intimate. When you speak about it publicly, it becomes subject to social pressures. It is about appearances, and appearances can lie. The significance here lies in the intuition. I think you might be in love. You're not telling me you are, but I think you might be. And if I dwell on that, that can tell me an awful lot more than if I were to just ask you, when you would probably lie. Loving secretly is too hard for me to bear. I shall let my heart reveal to him its color, the blush of the safflower. Love bursts into flower like nature itself. Love bursts into flower, a spontaneous act, like the mode of poetry that we're being told to prefer. On the autumn fields, mingled with the plume grass, blossoming flowers, colors flaunted openly, I'll love. If not, there is no way to meet. Human limitations? Willful limits? On the autumn fields, mingled with the plume grass, blossoming flowers, colors flaunted openly, I'll love. If not, there's no way to meet. It's the alternative to the earlier statement. If it's public, flaunted openly, I can deal with that. But here, this other poem, right next to it, always look at proximity. You start one place, go to another. What's the connection? What's the meaning? Here, no, I can't access what is most intimate in you. I can't access what is unspoken in you. But if the earlier poem said it's the only way, and this poem says it's not, the truth must lie somewhere in between. So I need to take those two polarities and find some negotiation between them, some nuance between them. The uncertainty and vulnerability and perceptibility that is the human condition. I love the seasonal evolution of love that comes next here. The warbler singing on the very topmost branch of my garden plum, even such a cry as that will break forth from my yearning. Then, can the young cuckoo singing in the footsore hills be as sad as I, yearning for you all night long, unable to sleep a wink? And then the mosquito flares, sputtering, fill the house with smoke now that summer's here. How long must they still smolder on, these fires in my stifled heart? I love the evolution here. The warbler. A warbler is just a singing bird, a songbird. And so it sounds so pretty and everything is happy. The warbler singing on the very topmost, high is good, branch of my garden plum, even such a cry as that will break forth from my yearning. Nature is bursting forth with song just like my heart. But then you take it down a notch. Time passes, perhaps. Can the young cuckoo, not as mellifluous as a warbler, perhaps, singing in the footsore hills, be as sad as I, yearning for you all night long, unable to sleep a wink? So here this relationship goes from first gush of oh to problems have sunk in. Singing in the footsore hills. You know, I love you, dear, but you make my feet hurt. Be as sad as I, yearning for you all night long, unable to sleep a wink. Suffering has entered into this relationship. Suffering of separation, perhaps, but it is painful. It is physical. Physical echoing emotion, which is echoing the natural imagery. All of this is being tied into one. And then, of course, the third one. You go from the warbler to the cuckoo, and then what? The mosquito. Love is a mosquito. The mosquito flares, sputtering, fill the house with smoke. Now that summer's here, how long must they still smolder on, these fires in my stifled heart? A mosquito is annoying. It has always been annoying. It has never been something that is pleasant to hear. So you can see the evolution. The warbler, the songbird, it's all so pretty and fresh. The cuckoo, a little bit more of an edge there, a little bit more dark. And now the mosquito. You have a love story in 3 acts here. Each one comes and goes, echoing impermanence, echoing delicacy, vulnerability. But that love of nature that you begin with and that evolves into, in the middle poem, a kind of love and nature where they're intertwined but not necessarily all in a good way. And then at the end where it's just pain. That's a love story. Ono Komachi, one of the female poets in this. Once I fell asleep in a momentary doze and saw him for whom I long, since when I have begun to place my trust in the things called dreams. Seems to be resisting this dream, resisting a dream state, but is indefensible to it, vulnerable to it. Very next one. When pressed with longing fiercely through desire's hour, in the bead black dark, I slip off the road of night to lie with it inside out. She is caving into the dream here. She's saying, all right, Dream, you got me. Ravage me. The wearing of the robe inside out has a certain cultural, cultic function, coded as very Japanese, very idiosyncratically Japanese, meaning not Chinese. But there is a kind of sensuality here that mixes the physical, kind of sexual physicality, and also the physicality of sleep, with this ephemeral, with this evanescent, with this dream state. And again, she is very vulnerable in this moment. She is surrendering herself to this dream, to this ideal of love, and rendering herself kind of powerless within it. You can make an argument, I would say, that she's not surrendering so much as she is adopting and thus retaining a kind of power, even as she seems to be giving in. She is in fact inviting in this dream, this lover, and that is a way that women can exercise their own power. Autumn nights, long only in name, let's meet, we say, yet dawn comes to us before we've begun. Love is indifferent to time, but time is overpowering. For me, not long enough at all. Autumn nights have always taken their measure from the depths of one's love. Taken their measure, that's an odd phrase. You measure something physical, you measure something material, something worldly. But love is kind of irrational. Oh no, Komachi again. Driven straight along by a longing without bound, I'll come by night, for surely none will rebuke me for trespass on the path of dreams. None will rebuke me. More shame, more sense of scandal. Society is an enemy here against the delicate feelings that she might have. But she is compelled. Again, the kind of vulnerability there. She has no choice but to follow this impulse. She is almost addicted. My longing without bound, that is language of addiction. Though on paths of dreams with no resting for my feet, I run to and fro. Such rendezvous are nothing to one glimpse of you that's real. So here, the worldly seems better than the ideal, which is an interesting contrast to the torture that the worldly seems to be putting her through in the previous poem. But through it all, love is transcendent. Love overpowers. Love is, like nature, that which will not be denied. And human beings are helpless in front of it. So they can only cultivate these tiny little poems, these tiny little truths for themselves in the face of so much violence in the world. And this mirrors the kind of culture that you see in the Heian period, which is enormously delicate, which is enormously emotional. You've never seen so many people cry as in a Japanese novel of the Heian period. It is emotional. It is, by our standards, often quite melodramatic. But that sense of delicacy, that sense of vulnerability is a specific choice, because when they are coming out of the shadow of a very aggressive and manly, masculine, tough guy culture over there in China, they want to be different. They want to be unique. They want to get in touch with something that is the opposite of what came before. That is more sensitive, that is more nuanced, more complicated maybe, but more natural and more authentic to human emotion, stripped of all of the culture that builds up around it.